The poverty premium, why being poor costs more than being wealthy today. A strange thing happens when people are financially unstable. Everything starts costing more, not just emotionally, not just mentally, literally more. More fees, more stress, more penalties, more expensive borrowing, more expensive transportation, more expensive food choices, more expensive emergencies. And one of the hardest parts about modern financial life is that many people are blamed for outcomes created partly by structural pressure they are constantly trying to survive inside. Because when people lack margin, small problems become expensive very quickly. So in this video, we're going to talk about something many people experience but rarely hear explained clearly: why financial instability itself often creates additional financial friction. Not because people are unintelligent, not because they lack ambition, but because instability changes the cost of everyday life in ways many financially stable people never fully notice. And honestly, nobody told us that. One of the biggest advantages of financial stability is not luxury, it's optionality. Stable people often have access to better borrowing rates, bulk purchasing, higher quality infrastructure, more reliable transportation, more flexible schedules, and more recovery time when problems appear. But when people lack financial margin, their decisions become heavily constrained by immediacy, not necessarily by preference, by necessity. For example, buying larger quantities of household items is often cheaper long term, but bulk purchases require upfront liquidity. And when someone is trying to survive week to week, the lower upfront cost usually matters more than the lower long term cost. So financially unstable households often end up paying more per item simply because smaller purchases are all the budget can absorb at the moment. Now multiply that across food, transportation, banking, housing, credit, and emergencies. Over time, those differences compound. Financial instability also changes how emergencies function. For financially stable people, an unexpected expense is frustrating. For financially unstable people, it can become destabilizing. A car repair might trigger late payments, missed work, overdraft fees, credit card debt, or high interest borrowing. And once financial pressure begins stacking, recovery becomes harder, not because people are irresponsible, but because instability reduces recovery capacity. That distinction matters. A financially stable person often has savings, credit access, support systems, or scheduling flexibility. A financially strained person may have none of those buffers, which means the same emergency produces very different outcomes depending on available margin. And over time, constant instability creates constant vulnerability to disruption. One of the least discussed parts of financial instability is cognitive load, because surviving instability requires enormous mental energy. Constant calculations, constant trade offs, constant prioritization. Which bill gets paid first? Can groceries stretch another few days? Can the gas tank wait? Can this fee be delayed? Can overtime cover the gap? And eventually, the brain becomes exhausted. This matters because stress affects focus, decision making, memory, long term planning, and emotional regulation, which means people operating under chronic financial pressure are not simply making choices inside neutral conditions. They are often making decisions while mentally overloaded, and mental overload can reduce strategic thinking capacity over time, not because people lack intelligence, but because people can have limited mental energy and attention, especially during periods of prolonged stress or instability. Another difficult reality is that lower cost options often create higher long term costs. Cheaper shoes wear out faster, unreliable cars create repeated repairs, poor quality housing increases maintenance problems, high interest borrowing creates compounding repayment pressure. And when people lack financial flexibility, they are often forced into shorter term decision cycles, not because they don't understand long term value, but because immediate survival needs dominate decision making. This is important because financially stable people sometimes assume if someone makes a more expensive long term decision, they must not understand finances. But often the issue is not understanding, it's access. People optimize around the constraints they actually have, not the ones outsiders assume they have. Modern financial systems heavily reward stability, and they heavily penalize instability. A missed payment becomes a fee, a low credit score increases borrowing costs. An overdraft creates additional charges. A delayed bill creates interest accumulation. And once someone falls behind, the financial recovery path can become increasingly steep. Again, This does not mean responsibility disappears. Personal decisions still matter enormously, but it's also true that instability itself creates additional friction costs. That's the important distinction. The conversation becomes much more productive when we stop reducing financial outcomes to good people versus bad people or smart people versus irresponsible people, because real life is more complicated than that. Most people are navigating a mixture of personal decisions, economic conditions, stress, opportunity, timing, health, support systems, and available margin. One of the most powerful things money creates is not status, it's recovery capacity. Margin creates breathing room, and breathing room changes decision making. People with margin can wait, compare options, recover from setbacks, absorb emergencies, and think longer term. Without margin, every decision becomes more urgent, and urgency changes behavior, which is why financial stability is not just about wealth accumulation, it's also about reducing the frequency of crisis decision making, because constant emergency thinking exhausts people psychologically. And eventually, many people stop thinking strategically simply because survival mode consumes too much mental energy. One reason this conversation matters is because many people silently blame themselves for pressures they never fully understood. They think, why does everything feel so expensive? Why does it feel impossible to get ahead? Why do small setbacks become huge problems? And sometimes part of the answer is that instability itself carries hidden costs. Not because society is secretly designed against individuals, not because success is impossible, but because financial stability and financial instability create very different operating environments. And once people understand that, something important happens. Shame decreases, clarity increases, and decision making often improves because people can finally start identifying where friction exists, where margin matters, and where stability creates leverage. That awareness matters, especially because many people have never had these dynamics explained clearly before. So if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Financial instability is not just about having less money. It's often about navigating higher friction, higher stress, fewer buffers, and more expensive recovery cycles, and understanding that reality does not remove personal responsibility, but it does create a more honest understanding of how modern financial life actually works. Because when people finally recognize the hidden costs of instability, they can begin focusing not only on income, but also on building margin, reducing friction, and creating structures that increase long-term stability over time. If this video helped you think differently about money, stress, and modern life, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need this perspective. Because this channel is not just about finances, it's about understanding how life actually works. And honestly, nobody told us that.